Welcome to American Zion's Past and Contemporary Mormonisms, a conversation between Betsy Gaines Quammen, Craig L. Foster, and Marianne T. Watson, moderated by Kirsten Joanna Allen of Torrey House Press. This event, co-hosted by Torrey House Press, Utah Humanities, the Book Bungalow, Grand County Public Library, and David Quammen and Betsy Gaines Quammen, is part of the 22nd Annual Utah Humanities Book Festival. This annual free festival is the Utah Humanities gift to the community, allowing us to explore all sorts of ideas by interacting with great writers. The complete program is available at www.utahhumanities.org. Our thanks also to the book festival's major sponsors, and there are a lot of them: George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation, Salt Lake City Arts Council, Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Fund, Summit County RAP, Weber County RAMP, the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, the King's English Bookshop, Weller Bookworks, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Catalyst. My name is Tanya Mills, and I'm the owner and manager of the Book Bungalow in St. George, Utah, Southern Utah's only independent bookstore offering all new books and a full range of events. While we're open and taking precautions right now, we're doing our events virtually. Let me introduce our guests briefly. Betsy Gaines Quammen, author of American Zion, Clive and Bundy, God, and Public Lands in the West, is a historian and conservationist. She holds a doctorate in environmental history from Montana State University, her dissertation focusing on Mormon settlement and public land conflicts. Terry Tempest Williams has described her book as brilliant and electrifying. Gaines Quammen's voice is bright, engaging, and smart. She listens. She is fair. But she is not seduced by cowboy mythology. Her vision calls for an ecological wisdom that can govern our communities, both human and wild, with reverence and respect. Betsy lives in Bozeman, Montana, with her husband, writer David Quammen, 3 huge dogs, an overweight cat, and a pretty big python named Boots. Craig L. Foster, one of the authors of American Polygamy, A History of Fundamentalist Mormon Faith, earned an MA and MLIS at Brigham Young University. He's also an accredited genealogist and works as a research consultant at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. Foster has published articles about different aspects of Latter-day Saint history and is also the author of 2 books, co-author of another, and co-editor of a 3-volume series discussing the history and theology of plural marriage. Foster is also on the editorial board of the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal. His co-author on American Polygamy, Marianne T. Watson, graduated from the University of Utah's History Department and was raised as a member of the Mormon fundamentalist group Apostolic United Brethren. She has been widely published and has presented at conferences, including the Mormon History Association, the Western History Association, and the first Mormon History Conference in Brazil in 2010. Our moderator, Kirsten Joanna Allen, manages editing, production, marketing, and fundraising for Torrey House Press. She also oversees acquisitions along with associate editor Ann Terashima and creative director Kathleen Metcalf. Though Kirsten is a native New Yorker, she's also a 6th-generation Utahn and feels most at home hiking in Utah's Red Rock country. She has 2 grown children and lives with a pair of cats and her spouse, Mark Bailey, in Salt Lake City and Torrey, Utah. Kirsten, why don't you begin?
Thanks so much, Tanya, and thanks again to Utah Humanities and to the Book Bungalow. We just cannot say thank you enough, Tanya, for hosting this event tonight. I'm Kirsten Johanna Allen. I'm a publisher and executive director of Torrey House Press, as Tanya said, Intermountain West only nonprofit literary press, and independent publishers and independent booksellers are married in the best of ways. And encourage all of you joining us today to hop on over to the Book Bungalow to buy Betsy Gaines Quammen's book and Marianne and Craig's book. You will be supporting a pillar of democracy by doing so, and supporting a really important independent business in Utah. Well, it's a pleasure to join all of you folks on the screen and all of you at home. I am joining you today from Torrey, Utah. I'm here in the ancestral lands of Paiute Ute and for a short time Navajo people. And I encourage you all to acknowledge for just a moment the Native peoples whose land you're sitting on today as you join this discussion about American Zions. Betsy's book, American Zion, Clive and Bundy God and Public Lands in the West, examines the religious roots of the movement opposing federal management of public lands as espoused by Clive and Bundy and his sons. Clive and Bundy lives not too far from where Tanya is in St. George. Clive and Bundy is near Mesquite, so maybe 90 minutes away or in thereabouts. Marianne Watson and Craig Foster's book, American Polygamy, A History of Fundamentalist Mormon Faith, details the history of polygamy as first practiced in the Mormon Church and then by fundamentalist sects starting at the end of the 19th century. And today we'll all be discussing some ideas of fundamentalism, who identifies with it and why. And we'll be hearing some readings from these two fantastic books. In fact, let us begin now. I'd like to ask you each to read a section from your book. I'll start with Betsy and then move to Craig and then Marianne. But before you do, tell us a little bit about how your book came to be, why you wrote your book, as you set up the excerpt that you're going to read for us. Betsy, would you mind starting us off?
Not at all. Thank you so much to everybody, Tanya and Kirsten and Torrey House and Bungalow Books and Utah Humanities, and it looks like Willy's here with us. Thank you, everybody. I began to think about these things. I had run an organization for years working with different religions and religious leaders on how they viewed landscape and looking at how they could get involved in conservation. And so my background is in conservation. I'm first and foremost, I love the land, and I was very interested in how religion informed opinions on landscape. And I decided to go ahead and pursue my PhD and wanted to study a religious or a faith that I didn't understand very well, but that had amazing archives and information and history. And so I began to study Latter-day Saints, and it's been an unbelievable experience as a historian. It's remarkable and a great deal of fun because there's just so much material out there. And so I studied Mormon settlement, and because I'm a conservationist, I was really interested in how land use wars were playing out and what kind of sort of religious layers there were to some sagebrush rebellion and some of these other land use conflicts. And so I, in studying Latter-day Saints and settlement, I began to realize that there were roots of early church beliefs that informed some of the conflicts that were happening. And I went and visited the Bundy family in 2015, the year after the Battle of Bunkerville, which was the standoff in Nevada. And I went to talk to them specifically about their faith. And I didn't want to hear about the details of the armed standoff. I wanted to hear why Mormonism was a fundamental piece of their battle. Cliven Bundy has called his fight with the government a holy war. And so, so it was very interesting, and they were incredibly, actually very generous with their time and spent a lot of time explaining their points of view with me. And then in writing American Zion, I went back and looked at the history of the Mormon Church, and I'm going to read a bit about Nauvoo and how sort of the period of time right before the murder of the prophet Joseph Smith. So I will do that right now, unless you want to have us talk about this.
No, I think that's great. Yeah,
Oh,
jump
okay.
right into your reading.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's terrific. Thanks for
All
setting
right.
it up like that.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for asking me. And I'm going to take off my glasses because that's the way I need to read. I'm sight deprived or whatever. Okay. In 1838, Joseph Smith had only 6 more years on earth before going to his glory. A member of the church might well consider these years the most productive period in Joseph's life. He was at the height of his prophetic force, the pinnacle of his authority, and the zenith of his productivity. By the time he was killed, a prodigious amount of theology had been left behind, some ideas that continue to excite those on the fringes of the Mormon religion. His most controversial revelations were on plural marriage and the idea that men could be gods, prophecies that led to his murder. But one of his most enduring prophecies, at least to our story, was that God divinely revealed the US Constitution. In fact, Cliven Bundy told me that it was Jesus who wrote it. After the Battle of Crooked River, Joseph was arrested, chained, jailed, and awaiting trial. No Missourian involved in the Hans Mill massacre faced any such fate, a bitter pill for the Latter-day Saints. Smith narrowly avoided a firing squad thanks to the sympathies of Missouri General Alexander William Doniphan, who objected to an initial denial of due process. Charged with treason, murder, arson, burglary, robbery, larceny, and perjury, Smith spent a long and miserable winter in the fetid Liberty County Jail awaiting trial. During his confinement, he corresponded with church leadership as well as with a property broker about acquiring roughly 20,000 acres of land, one from Dr. Isaac Gilland, a con man known to be a genuine horse thief, but not a genuine doctor. With this purchase and the acquisition of lands in Iowa and Commerce in Illinois, Joseph once again envisioned Zion, this time straddling the wide Mississippi River on both the Iowa and Illinois shores. After a 6-month incarceration, Joseph and his men were allowed to escape. This in part may have been because many in Missouri were embarrassed over the whole Mormon affair and did not want further negative national attention that Smith's trial and potential execution would have brought. In any case, after bribing the guards with $800 and a bottle of whiskey, Joseph Smith saddled up a horse and made for the new homeland, a place he called Nauvoo on the the river's Illinois side. Okay, and I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit to talk about some of the aspects of the Bundy story that were pertinent or that are pertinent in terms of the history of the early church. In 1840, Smith secured the Nauvoo City Charter and began to create a municipal government. After years of finding no reliable advocate on either state or federal levels, Smith started to entertain his own political ambitions. He made himself mayor and filled the courts with Mormon judges, and with those appointments created a more anti-Mormon sentiment among those who viewed his actions as theocratic and biased. But the prophet's intentions were understandable. The Mormon people had been run out of Missouri with no reparations, and although Joseph had pleaded for justice throughout the years, he'd repeatedly been disappointed by elected officials and the court systems. With all the lessons learned, Smith was going to make Nauvoo a permanent safe haven for his people by packing offices with his own. Another step towards defending his church was to build a militia. Danite ethos remained a deep cultural vestige, but in the 1840s, Smith wanted something grander than a gang of vigilantes. He gained authorization from the state of Illinois to raise an army, one called the Nauvoo Legion. At its peak, his Mormon force topped 5,000 members, making it the second largest armed force in the country next to the US Army. Although he had no military experience, the prophet gave himself the title of Lieutenant General, a rank that at the time had not been held by any military figure since George Washington. He rode in military parades, dressed in a splendid blue coat, epaulettes, and crisp white pantaloons. Around his waist, he wore a gold sash. Atop his head, a French-styled military hat adorned with 8 gold stars. This was a man who saw himself growing ever more mighty, one who spoke to God, shepherded an exploding number of supporters, and now had his own army.
Wonderful, Betsy. Thank you. That really kind of lays down some of the roots of the beginnings of the Mormon Church in its early days, and some of these early ways of thinking about the Constitution and land and polygamy and manifest destiny. A lot to come. Thank you so much. Craig, please share with us your excerpt that you've prepared. But first, tell us a little bit about why this book, why now?
Okay, thank you. In the process of editing The Persistence of Polygamy with Mill Bringhurst, the third volume had to do with fundamentalism. And we quickly realized that there really wasn't much that could be, there wasn't a good, solid work that gave a general history of fundamentalism. So I spoke with Mary Ann Watson, my friend, and I suggested, hey, why don't we write a history that's kind of an overview, general history of fundamentalism. And she thought that was a good idea. And so we began working together. We both have a history background. I come as a Latter-day Saint. She comes as a fundamentalist. And we jokingly said that we would keep each other honest there by having those two backgrounds. So I'll read a couple of excerpts. And the first one is early Mormons who accepted plural marriage did so as a matter of faith, endeavoring to establish family relationships that could last for time and all eternity, and eventually help qualify them for the highest exaltation in heaven. This same purpose motivates contemporary fundamentalist Mormons who have been separated from the LDS Church for almost 100 years to view plural marriage as a sacred essential. For them, it is still a matter of faith. Regarding the continuation of the principle of plural marriage, some time ago, 2 sisters reside in the small Utah fundamentalist community of Rocky Ridge were questioned about growing up in a polygamous household and asked if they too wanted to become plural wives. It was the girls' own marriage goals that seemed most profound. Both said they wouldn't mind living in plurality, either as a first wife or a plural wife, because it's the celestial law. Both also said they wouldn't mind marrying the same husband because they loved being with each other. Their expressions reflected sentiments of other women throughout the history of Mormon polygamy. Many close friends or even sisters throughout history have become sister wives. For the most part, being sisters or good friends helped make them more successful as sister wives because of their close bonds. Such ties between sister wives being sisterly rather than conjugal love can be almost as strong and godly as their respective marital relationships with their husbands. The older of the two wondered out loud if she truly wanted to be first wife. What if her husband decided after their marriage that he didn't want to live plural marriage? Marrying a single man might be risky, and she emphatically stated she wants to live the principle.
A lot to take in there, Craig. Thank you so much. I think that leads in really nicely to some excerpt from Marianne. Marianne, tell us a little bit about your involvement in this book and why it was important to you and your collaboration with Craig. Set us up a little bit for your excerpt of American polygamy.
Thank you. My story really began when I was 18 years old, when my grandmother asked me to transcribe the journals of my grandfather. He kept journals from about 1910 to the early 1950s. And so we have a history from him that's probably unparalleled for fundamentalist Mormons. And so that began for me a long search historically. And when I graduated from college when I was 18, but I went back as a grandmother and got my history degree from the University of Utah. And I was so impressed at a Western History Association meeting in the earlier, about 2002, with their publications, and I took their packet. And when Craig and I approached me about doing this history, I said, well, I know who I want to publish it. And so that we ended up going with Arcadia Press, and that's been a good experience. I chose two excerpts from the book. One is from an interview with, interestingly, that mine never read until recently, and it was from the 1970s of a woman in her 80s who was telling why her testimony, her experience of plural marriage. And she was born in 1800s, so she was, she would have been in her 70s at the time. She said, there's really no happiness more glorious than living the principle. In order to be happy, again, you have to purify your own soul, analyze yourself, look at yourself. You cannot live celestial marriage perfectly unless you try your best to be perfect. I would rather live plural marriage than I would monogamy. I have lived both, but I was happy in both, but I didn't know what true happiness was until I got into the principle. The next expert is from an aging husband of 5 wives, all in their 60s, with long-time marriages. He shared that, quote, he did not want to marry mamby-pamby servile wives, and that for marriages in a plural family to endure, it requires a real man to develop real relationships with real women as wives, who are adults, not little girls, he added. I only want intelligent wives, each with her own testimony of Jesus Christ, who can think, speak, and act for herself, and is capable to participate in a synergistic, loving, caring relationship that provokes emotional, intellectual, and spiritual growth, first and foremost with me and then with other family members. He admitted that most men and women are unwilling to make the personal sacrifices that can produce such time-proven relationships. And finally, from the last paragraph in our book, I will read, so for the sisters contemplating living the principle, as well as for the majority of other fundamentalists, their desires extend beyond the considerations of most couples getting married. Like their ancestors of old, their marriage decisions are also a deep and powerful matter of faith.
Thanks, Marianne. Today's fundamentalist Mormons in the American West do, like their forefathers and mothers, have resisted assimilation to the mainstream Mormonism, centered on faith. Though, as you point out, they survive despite legal and Mormon church efforts to end plural family arrangements. The Bundys' anti-federal government movement traces its roots to Mormon theology too, as Betsy points out, though they enjoy full participation in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Very, something diverged there. And kind of brings me to this line of questioning I have for each of you about fundamentalism. Craig, I'd like to start with you. As a historian and faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, how do you characterize the contemporary church's engagement or understanding of Mormon fundamentalism? Does that have any impact on your personal faith experience?
Good question. So I would say that that it varies within the LDS Church in terms of their understanding of fundamentalism and their engagement with fundamentalists. Some members are very well aware of fundamentalism and its history. A good percentage of them are not. As for me, I would say that overall it has strengthened my my faith in the church and in what we refer to as the gospel of Jesus. Action with fundamentalists, and obviously I've had a lot of interaction with members of the church, including local and even leaders within Salt Lake City, since I work in Salt Lake City. So for what I have found is that for fundamentalists and fundamentalism, I've found that same distrust among fundamentalists, depending upon which group they belong to, of the church in Salt Lake. I've also found respect among members of the church for fundamentalists. They'll be the first to say, we don't agree with them, we think they're wrong, but we think they're really good people, we have respect for them. And I've seen that same reaction among some fundamentalists, once again, depending upon which group they are from. And where they have respect for the church, they have respect for members of the church. Both sides think the other one is wrong. They'd all be together. So it's basically, I think there's a lot that can be learned on both sides from each other.
Thanks, Craig. Sometimes your internet is freezing a little bit, so if you could close some extra windows, or if there's anybody else in the home who might be willing to turn off their computer, that might help a little bit. Thanks. Marianne, okay. You grew up in the Apostolic United Brethren, one of the more liberal Mormon fundamentalist sects. You mentioned just a moment ago that you kind of got involved in writing this as you were looking at old journals from your own family. Has your understanding of Mormon fundamentalism either personally or kind of structurally changed or grown from researching and writing American polygamy?
I would say it has grown, but not necessarily altered, because I found a lot more information about the things that we researched for doing this book. So I've studied it for many, many years, and so it hasn't really fundamentally changed, but it has grown in quantity and the documents research.
Great, thank you. Betsy, the Bundy family and the Bundy movement, neither of these folks really identify as Mormon fundamentalists as far as I understand. But do you see Clive and Bundy as a type of Mormon fundamentalist?
You know, this is a really interesting question, and no, they don't. They would not consider themselves fundamentalists at all. However, there are influences of early Mormon theology that really influenced their movement. And as I talk about in my book, Ryan Bundy, who's Clive and Bundy's son, while they were taking over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, said to a journalist, this action was the most Mormon thing I've ever done. And so I try to unpack that and look at, as I said, the conversation that I had with the family centered around their faith and why their faith is so important to what they're doing. And so I would say the militia component, you know, the early church having a militia theology, as it's been called by some historians, this idea that the Constitution was very sacred, and at the time Joseph Smith really felt that the Constitution was important because of the freedom to practice religion, and the early Mormon people were very much, I mean, they were really attacked and saw violence because of the faith that they were practicing. So the Constitution, the militia, this idea, the white horse prophecy, which is most likely apocryphal, but it was the idea that the Mormon people would be the ones that would when the Constitution was hanging by a thread, it would be the Mormon people who would protect the Constitution. And again, as I said, that's probably an apocryphal revelation, but it's very important to the Bundy family, and really is a motivating factor in the work that they do. And then my basis of the book is Zion, which was, of course, Mormon homeland that was promised by Joseph Smith. It was meant to be in Missouri, and the Mormon people were pushed out of Missouri. And then there was the idea that Zion would be in Nauvoo, and then it wasn't. And so Brigham Young brought the Mormon people to the Great Basin, but there had always been the promise of Mormon homeland. So I feel like in looking at their public land battles, there is this idea of entitlement because this is Mormon homeland. And then the final layer is the idea of this anti-government mentality, which was very much a part of the early Mormon church because the government didn't protect the Mormon people. So as I said, it's not fundamentalism, but I do think that there are influences in church history that do influence the Bundy's position. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Now I'm back. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. To everybody joining us, we have today Marianne Watson and Craig Foster, authors of American Polygamy, and Betsy Gaines Quammen, author of American Zion. These are two fabulous books that I encourage you to think about purchasing right this moment from the Book Bungalow. You can go to, if you're joining us on Zoom, the links are in the chat. And if you're joining us on Facebook, the links are in the comments. Remember, Book Bungalow is one of Utah's really valuable, most wonderful independent bookstores, the only one in Southwest Utah, in fact. And please join the conversation by buying a book. also join the conversation by asking some questions. If you have some questions for Betsy or Marianne or Craig, some things that you've wondered about fundamentalism or the militia movement or Mormon fundamentalists, please ask your question in the chat on Zoom or in the comments on Facebook Live, and we'll be tossing those questions to our panelists in just a few minutes. Marianne, I've got a question for you. American polygamy presents a very thorough history of polygamy, both within the Mormon Church and after John Taylor's 1886 revelation upholding polygamy within Mormon fundamentalist sects that developed in the following decades. Can you talk a little bit about what are the characteristics of polygamist adherents who have embraced fundamentalism as an identity, both contemporary and historical? In other words, who are the folks who identify as fundamentalist?
By and large, you only get converts from the LDS Church, people that have already either been raised in the church, the Latter-day Saint Church, or have been converted to it as adults. So people don't convert from other religions directly to fundamentalism, in my experience, although that may be true in some cases on outlying groups and so for the most part, they have to have a really solid Latter-day Saint foundation of scripture and stuff. People that stay are the ones that study a lot. People that just enter into plural marriage because it's a socially acceptable thing to do among fundamentalist circles sometimes do not last, because it's a difficult lifestyle, and there are a lot of challenges that are not readily visible to outsiders. It's financially difficult. It's a relationship challenging, and so they have to have a lot of fortitude. And a friend of mine who's a historian has said that most of the women he has met who are in-your-face women, that his experience was that across the board of meeting people from several groups. So I thought that was an interesting observation.
Thanks, Marianne. Oh, go ahead.
No, is there more you would like to say about that?
No, that's great. So what you are saying is fortitude is something that you really see as a characteristic that goes across all different sects, and a rootedness in some Latter-day Saint Mormon history, Mormon cultural experience. Yeah. Craig, I've got a question for you next. Across religions, scripture is always selectively adhered to, and Mormonism doesn't take some of its own scripture literally, just like other religions. Yet fundamentalism emerges from many religions. Why do you think Mormon fundamentalism arose around polygamy and not other scripture? Is Mormon fundamentalism a reaction to the Mormon Church's official rejection of polygamy in the 1890s? And was that official rejection purely transactional to allow for statehood? So kind of a two-part question there. Why did Mormon fundamentalism arise around polygamy, and was that a transactional situation?
Well, I'm going to go with the second part first, and that is, I think for many it was more of a transactional thing. Among both the leadership and the membership of the church, they felt that we can still get around the what was stated in the manifesto. They viewed that more as something to please the U.S. government, because they were in the process of destroying the church, literally. They had taken property, they had taken possession of the temples, they were persecuting them in terms of going after them both legally and judicially. And so they felt that the manifesto would be a way bit of peace to them, and that they could still get around plural marriage by either marrying in Canada, down in Mexico, etc. And as I like to tell people, they accepted the manifesto, but a lot of them winked at it. And personally, I'm glad they did, because my grandmother was born in 1892 to the fifth wife. So I wouldn't be here if my great-grandfather and great-grandmother hadn't kind of winked at the manifesto. Now, in terms of why did plural marriage seem to be the thing that fundamentalists latched onto, or whatever, as a way of expressing their fundamentalism? That would be because plural marriage was and is still, for fundamentalists, a very important doctrine within the LDS Church. In order to obtain the highest degree of the early members of the church and fundamentalists continue to believe that they had to live plural marriage, because that was part of the celestial law, celestial marriage. And so that when it came time that they had the manifesto, and then the second manifesto where they were basically saying, no, really, you've got to stop living this. And then the third manifesto, which was basically, you stop living this or we're going to excommunicate you. There were many who could not accept that, because they believed and had been taught that this was such an important doctrine for their eternal salvation. So for fundamentalists to basically grasp onto plural marriage as being the fundamental of their religion, that's not surprising, given the early teachings of John Taylor, etc. And so I understand where the fundamentalists are coming from in terms of their of this being the pillar of fundamentalism. There are other things that they feel the church has abandoned or forgotten about that they do teach, but obviously plural marriage is the main thing. And now Marianne can tell me if I got that right.
Marianne, if you've got a response to that.
Well, it's in part a really important theological viewpoint is that in the restoration of the gospel, as through the prophet Joseph Smith, as Mormons like to say it, there is a specific goal to prepare for the second coming of Christ, and part of that goal is to see the restoration of the house of Israel. And as they see it, that cannot be achieved without having kings and queens, as it were, covenant kings and queens prepared to help save the house of Israel. And so they see that as part of an end time scenario. It's not in a vacuum. Doesn't take place outside of, it's just what we believe in. There's a purpose. They see a purpose in it for the redemption of the house of Israel.
Thanks for that clarification, Marianne, that on how that plural marriage is viewed as fundamental. That I was having a little trouble drawing that connection. Why plural marriage? Why not something else? But I understand it better now, for sure. Betsy, you have written that Cliven Bundy's fight against the federal government's management of America's public lands is an extension of his faith. Just as we see that Mormon fundamentalists, it's an extension of their faith as they are living in opposition to the federal government, to law. You've also pointed out that Bundy has called his movement a holy war. Yet the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has asserted in statements that it does not approve of the Bundys using Mormon scripture to justify their activities. At the same time, they have not been excommunicated. What religious beliefs underpin the Bundys' anti-government activities, and why do you think the Bundys and other Mormon anti-government militia members have not been excommunicated when polygamists are?
Yeah, I think that this is a really good question, and it's something that I've given a lot of thought to. The church did come out after the takeover of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and said, as you just said, that church scripture should not be used to justify the takeover of this refuge, but they haven't been excommunicated. Ammon has said that they have support in higher levels of Mormon leadership. And I am not sure why the church hasn't excommunicated them. I actually talked to Richie Stedman about this, who has a podcast called Cultural Hall, and he's a member of the he's LDS, and I didn't get into the details, but he has been excommunicated and is now back in the church. So because I'm not a member of the Mormon Church, I don't have insight into what constitutes a something so egregious that one is excommunicated, but it does seem strange because the Bundys have actually put people in real peril, and have done so under the banner of their faith. I do want to. There's a question that I'm seeing that sort of ties into this answer too, if I can do that. If somebody asked if the Bundys get revelations, when before the Malheur takeover, Ammon did say that he had been praying and that God had told him to go to Malheur on behalf of a father and son, the two ranchers who were going to jail for arson. And he said that God told him to go, and that he was told that if he didn't go, that God would be disappointed. So yes, the Bundys are they claim to be in dialogue with God over their actions.
Yeah, Betsy, there's kind of a follow-up question to that one. Do you have a sense of how many followers the Bundys have, and if they have, do they write their revelations down, or do other followers consider those revelations that the Bundys say they receive?
Do they have a lot of followers? Yeah, I would say yes. In fact, when I first went to visit the Bundys, I thought that they were somewhat of an outlier. And I really feel like the Bundys and their actions have inspired a great deal of militia maneuvering. And I think we're seeing it right now. The militia has never been, and again, by saying the militia, that implies that it's a unified group. There are several militias and several movements, but I do think that the Bundys have inspired militias to feel more empowered and to come out and enforce with long guns. And they've been involved in the anti-mask protests and the reopen protests. I think they've been really inspirational to the proliferation of the militia. In terms of revelations, I don't think that people, I don't think they've written them down, or that people follow their revelations in the same sense that the prophet has revelations. But they do have a book called the Nay book, which they carry around with them, that have revelations from prophets over the years in terms of fighting for the Constitution. So that's very much a part of, I mean, if you go to if you're involved in their conflicts or protests, that they have the NA book with them. And when I went to visit the family, Ryan had the NA book there, opened it up, showed it to me, flipped through the pages. And so revelation is really important to them, but it's revelation from prophets over the decades.
Thanks, Betsy. That leads us a little bit into another question. I think this is from Tanya. And this is to all three of you. For both the Bundys and fundamentalist Mormons, there seems to be a low or lower regard for the U.S. government. How would each of you characterize, how would you authors characterize feelings towards the U.S. government? Feelings, the Bundys' feelings, or the feelings of fundamentalist Mormons towards the U.S. government today. Betsy, you're speaking to that a little bit with the Bundys' push about their view of the Constitution. Do you want to jump on that? How would they characterize their feelings about the U.S. government?
Well, they do not like the U.S. government, and particularly, and this is, I mean, it's going to be a completely different question, I think, for Marianne and Craig. They do not like the regulations that the U.S. government has imposed upon them. They did, the Endangered Species Act and the protection of the desert tortoise. Initially the government asked Cliven to decrease the number of cows that he had grazing in Gold Butte. He didn't want to do it, and eventually he stopped paying his grazing fees. The lease was canceled, and so the anti-government agitating really came about because of environmental regulations, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think that it would be interesting to hear from Marianne and Craig.
Yeah, Craig, Marianne, jump in.
I think that the fundamentalist attitudes toward the government reflect more of the 18th century views of Mormons as and their struggles for statehood, their struggles for the LDS Church to get statehood for Utah. It was a push against the many laws that were there, but I don't think there's an anti-government feeling in and of itself, just where there's corruption or where it particularly involves something that they feel like they can't go against their conscience. And that was reflected in a lot of the lawsuits that took place in the 1800s.
In several different groups. And I would say that it also depends upon the group. In fact, I'm aware of some fundamentalists who work for the federal government. I don't think the government knows that they are polygamous, but so it all depends. Some on which group they come from. I would say that AUB, for example, being a group that, as Marianne said, as long as they're not encroaching upon their rights or anything, they have full support of the federal government and what they do. So while other groups, the FLDS, for example, might not have as friendly feelings toward the federal government as some of the other groups would.
So just as each of the sects has a different practice of polygamy, a different outlook, they're going to have a little different relationship or set of feelings around the federal government today. Is that right?
Absolutely. Fundamentalism, Mormon fundamentalism, is not monolithic. In fact, some of the groups, if you put them all up and compared them all, you would be amazed at there are significant differences between some groups and others.
We have a saying that where you have two polygamists, you have three opinions.
Good to know. Sounds a little bit like the disjointedness of the militia movement too. I have a wonderful question is coming from Karen Anderson, who is a Utah author, and she's a Torrey House author. She's wonderful. Her book is called Before Us Like a Land of Time. It's a novel set in late 19th century and early 20th century. It's wonderful. Can't recommend it enough, not just because I was her editor, but she asks you all, she says, I understand fundamentalism as a commitment to literality, the rejection of language, especially sacred texts, as personally interpretable, metaphorical, or ambiguous. It strikes me as the antithesis of poetic practices. Can this angle help me better understand the people you've written about? So the understanding fundamentalism as a commitment to literality, to really taking things very, very literally without some of the other kinds of interpretation out there. Can you speak a little bit about fundamentalism and literality in terms of the people you've written about?
Well, I think that there again, it's there's a wide spectrum. There's no monolithic answer by a long shot, but I will say that yes, they're probably more. She will probably find an answer more in the literalistic interpretation and viewpoint when it comes to that.
And just, I think the book is Before Us Like a Land of Dreams, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I
Okay.
always say that wrong. Thank you. Before Us
It's,
Like a Land of Dreams.
Beautiful book. It's amazing. I love it so much. And I don't know if this is quite answering the question, but I really believe that the Bundys are motivated by these series of revelations that they, as I said, they bring with them in this this sort of the Nay book, which is just a binder full of prophecies from Benson, Ezra Taft Benson. Okay.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'm dyslexic, so if somebody has three names, I'm going to get them scrambled. But I really think that they feel like it's their religious obligation to follow these revelations, that they are protecting the Constitution, that they are literally the actors that are carrying out these revelations. And that their protests are an extension of their faith that way. They're actually religious rites, is the way I describe them in my book.
Extension of the faith. That is definitely what we're talking about today, isn't it? In terms of fundamentalism, whether it's a literal fundamentalism or not. Just a couple of last questions. Do the Bundys believe in polygamy? Do they believe in paying taxes?
The Bundys do. They don't believe in polygamy. That's not something that they practice. And in terms of paying, this is an interesting question, because the Bundys continued to try to pay their grazing fees, and they would take their money to Clark County. He didn't just stop paying. He didn't want to pay them to the government. So in terms of taxes, I think they pay their taxes. But they did not want to pay grazing fees, and they really did try to take it to Clark County, but the Clark County there was no process. So yeah, it's kind of arbitrary.
Well, thank you. Do we have any last questions before we wrap up? Marianne, Craig, Betsy, any questions you have of each other?
No, but I'm very eager to read your book. It sounds so interesting. I guess I do have some questions. Marianne, where do you live?
Well, I used to live in Utah County. Now I live in St. Pete County, but I've lived in Utah or Salt Lake all my life until recently.
Okay. And is your do you live in a fundamentalist community?
not per se. I live around a lot of polygamists, but not in a city has a normal name that's known in Utah.
So once again, depending upon the group, some groups live within distinct. Talks about Colorado City,
Right.
Arizona, Hilldale, Utah. Then other groups, they kind of live basically anywhere. And among members of the Apostolic United Brethren, they do have certain areas where they live, but they for the most part, as a polygamous community. They do have some that could be identified specifically as a polygamous community, but they also just live just in regular, subdivisions. And I've had friends that ask me, well, you can tell that they're polygamous, can't you? And I've said, actually, not all polygamists look like, with the prairie dress, kind of in the poof style. And so, no, depending upon the group, you may not be able to tell that they are fundamentalists and polygamists. And so it really varies.
Yeah, and that's thank you for that answer, because I feel like I need to educate myself. I've been to Colorado City and Short Creek, and but I think it's really interesting to make that distinction, that these aren't just communities that kind of stand alone, that these adherents kind of proliferate throughout various areas. So thank you for that answer. You're educating me.
It draws us all back to the title of this discussion, American Zions. And this review, this examination of fundamentalism helps us really think about, how many different ways there can be a strict and literal interpretation of belief, of religious connotation, that whether it's militia, whether it's Mormon fundamentalism, there is not a monolith in either of these ideas that are really unique in having sprung from this part of the country, from the roots of a 19th century church that continues to shape really American life, and particularly American life in the West.
Well,
I would like to just invite everybody to hop on the chat, whether it's on Facebook Live or on Zoom, and take this survey. There's a very, very short survey that really helps the Utah Humanities Book Festival understand about how you felt about this event. They really take feedback very seriously and really want to be a part of the conversation with you and all of the programming that they do. So please take just a moment to take a quick survey, Moncase survey for Utah Humanities Book Festival. Craig, final thought? Oh, looks like we've.
Even the interpretation of Zion will vary. It'll vary among members of the church, and it will vary. So, for example, the Bundys, their interpretation of Zion would be very different probably from mine, since I'm not a cowboy. I live in a city, and my interpretation would be different from members of the AUB, which would be different from the FLDS and all the others. So even the phrase, about Zion, it varies. And the only other thing I have to say about fundamentalism, I did want to read one thing really quickly, if that's okay, from the back of our book.
Sure, just quickly, you can wrap us up.
fundamentalist Mormons in the American West resist assimilation like their forefathers. Centered on faith, they survived despite efforts to permanently end their cherished plural family arrangements. And you have some fundamentalists like Warren Jeffs who go rogue and corrupt their beliefs in heinous crimes. Most fundamentalists hold steadfastly to a religion they say is biblical and restored by the first Latter-day Saint prophet, Joseph Smith. And so you're going to get some examples like Warren Jeffs, who just have really given a black name, a bad name to fundamentalism. But most fundamentalists are law-abiding, except for that minor little thing about having more than one wife. And I just wanted to emphasize that. And at least in my opinion, the Bundys don't represent all of the members of the LDS Church.
Oh, yeah, that absolutely. And I make that abundantly clear too. They do not whatsoever. I love the idea though, talking about Zion and all the many different Zions, because I go back and look at the national park, Zion National Park, and look at all the players that had different interpretations of that particular space, even though it was, it was named after the idea of sacred Mormon homeland, and there are multiple interpretations of it. So, but no, thank you for bringing that up. The Bundys are in no way, shape or form representative of the Latter-day Saints.
Well, thank you. I think we need to wrap up and send everybody back to the rest of their wonderful Saturday afternoon. Please share this video. It is shareable on Facebook. Please visit the book Bungalow to buy American Zion, American Polygamy, or any other book that you just happen to need. The book Bungalow can take care of you. They can ship absolutely anywhere. And I'd like to thank all of our authors and panelists today, Marianne Watson and Craig Foster, authors of American Polygamy, and Betsy Gaines Quammen, author of American Zion. Thank you for this exploration into some very interesting divergences that have grown from a uniquely American religion, the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And your books are coming at a very interesting time in the cultural conversation of our country, I think, as even though we've got many other things going on, religious underpinnings of our communities, of our personal behaviors make a big difference in what we think, what we do, where we live, how we live. So thank you for joining this conversation. Thanks to all of you at home, and thanks very much to Utah Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the book Bungalow.